And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rod Zeeb. Rod is passionate about helping families prepare their children and grandchildren for the inheritances they will receive and to thrive together as a family for multiple generations. He is a self-proclaimed recovering estate planning attorney with a casual and easygoing persona. While he greatly enjoys and takes pride in founding the Heritage Institute, his true passion is working one-on-one with families. He's known for guiding them to a place of increased confidence, preparing their heirs, and having more fun. In the early 1990s, Rod began studying why only a few families continued to thrive and grow from generation to generation. While most families imploded by the end of the third generation, this phenomenon later became known as the 90% rule, as numerous studies, books, and articles concluded that approximately 90% of families fail to keep their family and family wealth together for 3 or more generations. Rod studied what the 10% of families who thrived for multiple generations did. As a result of this study, Rod co-developed the Heritage process and later founded the Heritage Institute to train other estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, philanthropic advisors, and other professionals to help their clients beat the 90% rule. These and ongoing seminars support SJSU's mission as a center of knowledge, including estate planning and financial literacy. Without further ado, I turn it now to Rod.
All right, thank you. And, you know, my goal is today to be done with at least like 15 minutes left for questions. So if you have those questions, put them in the chat or think about them, and we'll be able to talk about it at the end. It's interesting when people see this, the power of your story, or we're going to talk about your story. A lot of times they look at it and say, oh, this is the soft side of planning. And as you'll see, there's nothing soft about this. There are studies that it actually builds resilience in your family and takes care of a lot of other issues in your family. So that's what we're going to talk about in all this. Again, that's me. Okay, that's easy enough to go through. And this is like Annie said, this is the second of a three-part series that we're going to talk to you about. The third one is going to be in September. On using philanthropy as a training tool for your children and grandchildren, because it is an amazing tool to help them learn lots and lots of things with money they can't spend on themselves anyway. So it is a great tool to do that. That'll be in September. So, but today is the power of your story and life lessons. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with a quick review, and it really is going to be a quick review because this is what we went through. If you weren't there before, or if you were there, you may not remember. It all starts with the 70%, 90%, okay? And what this came from is there's all sorts of studies that came to the conclusion that there's about a 70% failure rate at each generation. So 70% of the time, the money is gone by the end of the second generation, which then means that about 91% of the time, it's gone by the end of the third generation. It's been rounded up to the 90% rule because that's easier to say. But like I said, this is all over, and it was documented in a book called Preparing Heirs that Roy Williams and his partner wrote several years ago. And so when you look at that, as Annie said, what we did is we went back and studied, okay, what did the 10% do differently? What did they do right? And so that's what we did. And ultimately what we discovered is that successful families create and maintain a culture of communication, trust, and mentoring that's all wrapped around their family purpose. And that takes time. Think about culture. Culture doesn't happen in a weekend or a meeting or whatever. It takes time and intentionality to make that happen. So what we did as we went through this, and as we studied these families, there were these certain attributes, or we call them elements, that kept popping up that they shared. And so we identified 12 of them that families shared who were into their third or fourth or fifth generation and were successful. And that's in that white paper, the Sustaining Family Wealth and Unity white paper that you've sure received, or it's on our website if you haven't received it yet. So what we want to do is start with a poll here. And this is like, okay, so our family, this is, you know, your family. Have you documented your family story, at least as far back as you know, for the benefit of future generations? And you can mark completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree. And we'll give you a couple seconds to answer those. Wow, you guys are above the curve. That's good. I had one group that was out of 30 some people, there was one person who mostly disagreed and everybody else completely disagreed because they hadn't done anything. So that's good. I mean, we got what, almost 50%. So like I said, that culture, creating that culture of communication, trust, and mentoring wraps around their family purpose. Your family purpose is what drives all of this. But that's not what people think. And so as you'll see by this slide, this next slide here, 2009, so right after the crash in 2008, Family Office Exchange surveyed their members and said, what do you think is going to get you? And as you add those up, 37% was investment, 26% was economy, 16% was financial constraints, which means taxes. So about 78, 79% of it was all about money. Only 7% of it was family dynamics and relationships. And the other thing is just everything else was 15%. What's interesting is then Roy Williams and his partner Vic did this study, and they studied about 3,250 families who had wealth a generation ago and lost it, and said, okay, so what got you? And as you can see here, 60% of the time it was lack of communication and trust. 25% of the time was unprepared errors, which would be lack of mentoring. And this actually came out after we had come up with the, you need a culture of communication, trust, mentoring wrapped around your family purpose. That's the no family mission, this family purpose. So, 85% of it is covered in those areas. That 5% that says everything else, that's the 78% that we thought, the people from Family Office Exchange thought was going to get them. So as you can see, it's almost backwards from what we think is going to get us. We all think it's about they're going to spend all the money or whatever. That's not what does it. What causes all of this is the lack of communication, trust, and mentoring. And it was interesting when I finally met Roy, I thanked him for doing all the study and spending all the time and money to verify what we had learned kind of anecdotally by studying all these families. More recently, there's been a study, it's called the Generative Family Study. It's been Dennis Jaffe and some other folks have been doing this for a while now. And this is all over the world again, like ours was. They've been studying families all over the world. And these are families who are into the third or fourth generation. They're still maintaining the values that they had from the first generation. They've kept everything together. And what they found was that families have different kinds of capital. One's financial capital, is your money, but other things were like the family office, philanthropy, things like that. But they found that the most important type of capital was what they call legacy capital. And they illustrate it with, legacy capital in the middle and everything else kind of revolving around it. So I called Dennis and I said, okay, so what is this legacy capital? And the definition that they have was, it's the mission, values, core purposes, and shared meaning that are the foundation of the family and its approach to wealth and the relationships to each other. So it's that culture that we talk about. It's the culture of communication and trust. It's the non-financial and financial, the non-financial and familial wealth. So this is really that culture of communication, trust, and mentoring that we talked about earlier. That's what they found ties it together. And that study's just finished last year. So this is current stuff. So when you think about it, there's three parts, three components to really good planning. There's financial planning, where you grow and protect and all your assets and do all of that. Then there's estate planning, which is where I was at and when I was the estate planning attorney, which is where you pass all that stuff to the next generation. Heritage design is the third part, which prepares the next generation for what they're going to get. So that's really why it's called the third component. It's the essential third component to successful planning. It's one thing to get it. It's another thing to be able to pass it. It's a third thing, though, to prepare the next generation so they don't blow it all. And this was described one time by a client of mine he was introducing me to his friend. And as we got talking about this, his friend goes, oh, I've already done my planning. I've done my estate planning. I've done my financial planning. Why am I looking at this? And what my client said to him was, financial planning and estate planning helps you pass what you own to future generations. But that's not enough. Heritage design helps you pass who you are and builds that culture of communication and trust and mentoring that you need to keep the family together. And, it was really interesting about, you said, it's not done. Your planning isn't done until you've finished passing your story, your life lessons, and prepared your heirs for what they're going to get. So as we do that, here's poll number 2. The first one was our family has done this. This one is I have documented my story. So this may be a little lower, a little higher, because a lot of times I work with families that we know especially there's a business owner, we know the grandpa's story, but we don't know your story. So now the question is, have you documented your story and life lessons for the benefit of future generations? All right, that's still pretty good. You're still over 30, over a third have documented your story, and that's good. By the way, when you're done documenting your story, you're not done documenting your story because you're still living. So that's one of the things that you have to update as time goes on. The important thing in here is sharing your story and life lessons is part of that passing who you are. And it needs to be in writing or video or something else that's going to last longer than you are. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it has to be in a format that the next generations can see, hear, whatever. And as you're telling that story, one of the things you have to do is, particularly if you're talking about landmarks and things like that, you have to describe it really well, because it could be that landmark's not there when they're reading it or hearing it. So sharing your story and life lessons is just a part of creating that culture of mentoring and communication, trust, and mentoring that builds the resilience. And this is not the soft side of planning. I said that earlier, but it's interesting. I had one guy that's his comment to me is, I don't need this Oprah frou-frou stuff. I've got a business. And so he was like, why do I want to do this? Well, number one, because it is what starts that culture of communication. You're passing your story. You're passing things that they don't know. And particularly if you have stories from the generations before you. But it isn't just that. Passing your story and life lessons builds resilience in the family, in the kids and grandkids, which is, something I didn't expect. Most of these studies now have come out in the last 10 years at the latest, probably 5 or 10 years, and some of them even in the last couple of years. One of them was by Duke, and he studied resilience, and one was done after 9/11. And found that the people who bounced back from 9/11, the people who knew their story and life lessons bounced back quicker than the ones who didn't. And there was another one about college students, and the same thing. Those students who knew their family story, knew where they came from, knew that foundation, they had more resilience than everybody else. And it's a part of a whole series of articles and studies. One of them was written, it's in the New York Times. Well, actually, no, let's do the first one. The first one was a study that was done by Carol Clark, and it came out an article came out in April of 2020. So this is just after the pandemic hit, called How Family Stories Help Your Children Weather Hard Times. And here's the quote. Standardized measures showed that children and families that told the more coherent family narratives had better self-esteem, higher levels of social competence, higher quality friendships, and less anxiety and stress. They also had fewer behavioral problems as reported by their parents. That's real things here, that you need. Another study that was done, and it was actually, it's called Stories That Bind Us, that was reported in the New York Times. Its conclusion was, the bottom line, if you want happier family, create, refine, and retell the story of your family, your family's positive moments, and your ability to bounce back from difficult ones. That act alone may increase the odds that your family will thrive for many generations to come. So as I said, this isn't this offsite. This is building what's really important. And we're going to talk about how you do this. I'm going to walk you through a process of doing this. And there's some other resources you can have. But this is only a part of building the culture and giving the rising generation context for where they came from and stuff. It's important, and it's really the first part, but it's only part of it. And as you do this, it's important that you make it somewhere that's accessible and somewhere that they can get to and readily read. If you just print it all out and hand it to them, they're probably not going to read it at this point. So there needs to be some way of putting it into on a website or a document or somewhere where they can get to it and do it, electronically. You want to, oops, okay, I forgot we had another poll here. So this is, do you have that commonplace? There's some, and sometimes in your, with your financial advisors or estate planning attorneys, something like that, they may have a vault. Is there something like that where your kids and grandkids can find the story and the life lessons and read it? Yeah, mostly don't. Yeah, and we do have some resources where you can do that and find a way of doing that, so that the whole family can get to it. And you want to avoid the telephone game. Let's talk a little. This is going to take a little bit longer. First of all, they need to hear it from you to the extent that they can. And so starting now, one of the ways that you can start telling your story is creating like a tradition when the family gets together. If they get together for Thanksgiving, have a story or two that you're going to tell about past Thanksgivings or Christmas, or if there's families that get together every year at the 4th of July, that's when they have their family gathering. They all go to the lake house. In places where you have a lot of the family together, have a mechanism for you and others to tell stories of the family. If it's a short period of time, if it's 15, 20 minutes, something like that, kids really enjoy it. If it gets to be too long, they don't enjoy it that much. But if it's a short period of time, they like hearing these stories and they like hearing them from you, and they like being able to ask the questions. My son actually worked with a husband and wife who didn't have any kids. And so the nieces and nephews were their heirs, and they had like 60 of them. And so they decided to have a family meeting, bring them all in and explain what was happening with the estate and that they were all going to be heirs. And so Ryan, my son, said to him, okay, while we're doing this, you need to tell some of your stories. And the aunt said, oh, these kids don't want to hear from this old lady about what she did. And he goes, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll block off like 10 minutes and let me ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll let them ask questions. And then we'll see if they want us to keep going. But if they want us to keep going, will you keep going? And she said, yeah. 3.5 hours later, they got done telling stories because the kids really wanted to understand where they came from and how they accumulated what they did, why they were heirs, why they wanted to give it to the grandkids and things like that. So having that opportunity to tell them, that's one thing. But then, like I said before, the other piece to this is making sure it's written down, it's video, it's all that stuff. I one of my clients that we were talking, he said, oh, my kids know my story. We've talked about it. And I said, well, is it written down? He goes, nah, but they know the story. And I asked him this. I said, so did you ever play the telephone game? He said, oh, yeah. You mean that game where you whisper something in somebody's ear, and by the time it gets around to the other side, it's completely different? And I go, yeah. And he said, yeah. And I said, so what do you think is going to happen when your great granddaughter, who's never met you, is telling your story to her daughter? And he thought for a minute, he gets this little smile and he goes, I could be a superhero by then. And his wife just looked at her and looked at him and goes, or? And it was like, all of a sudden you realize, on the other hand, it could be completely different. He goes, yeah, you're right. We kind of need to get this into a story into a mechanism that it's going to be my story and not something else. So creating those opportunities is an important thing. And then getting it in writing, getting it on video. And if now getting it on video is so easy, if you got an iPhone or whatever, just record it. Because now think for you, if you could hear something from your great grandparents or something like that, would you rather just read the words, or see grandma telling it. It's so video is, and it's so much easier now than it used to be. Video is really a big deal, and it's really easy then to transfer electronically so that people can get it. And it all starts with why. Why are you telling this story? And there's different kinds of family stories. There are just the stories, which are interesting and fun and all that. And then there's the stories that are life lessons. It's turning points in your life. How'd you make a difference in your life? And let me give you an example of this, and then I'll tell the story, and then I'll walk you through it, and you can try and just jot down real quickly in your own mind, or think about it in your own mind, and then we'll talk about how you can do this more. But I was actually at a big conference. It was a fundraising professionals conference, and we were talking about this. And somebody raised their hand and goes, "Can you give me an example?" And I didn't want to tell my story because, So I said, "Okay, somebody want to volunteer?" And this lady raised her hand. She goes, "I'll volunteer." And there's probably 100 people in the room. So I'm thinking, good for you. So she walks up to the stage, and we had a chair up there. So I sat down, she sat down. I said, "All right, let me kind of walk you through this." I said, most people had someone in their life when they were growing up who had a huge impact on them. Could be a parent, but a lot of times it's a friend or a neighbor or teacher or coach or something like that. So think about that. When you were growing up, who was it that really had a big impact on you? And can you think of her? And you go, think of somebody. She goes, "Oh yeah." And like right away. And I said, "Well, who was it?" She gave me her name. And I said, "So, what'd you do? I mean, what'd you learn from her?" And she said, "Well, she was a neighbor of ours down the street, and she was a single woman, and she would travel internationally. And when she traveled internationally, she would come back and she would invite all the neighborhood kids in, and she would show all the pictures that she had. We'd have tea from whatever country it was that she had gone to. And she did this like every year. She took a big trip. And so, it was fascinating. I said, "Well, so what'd you learn from that?" And she goes, "I learned a lot of things." She said, "First of all, I learned a single woman could do that." Now, and she was my age, okay? So this is in the 50s that she's having this happen. And so, if you're my age, that in the 50s, that wasn't the message that women were getting, that single women could do anything. So she learned that, a single woman could do this on her own. She said, "The other thing I learned was it isn't all about us. We can learn a lot of things from other countries." I kind of had this feeling that we had it all together and everybody could learn from us. But I started understanding there's so much culture, so much out there that we don't know, that we can learn from other people. And, it made a huge impact on my life. And I said, "Well, in what ways?" And she laughed and she goes, "Well, I married an immigrant and I raised money for an international charity." And everyone in the crowd started laughing. She goes, "So you can see this had a big impact." And I said, "All right, cool. Do your kids know that story?" And again, she laughed. She goes, "No, they don't, but they will on Thursday, because we're having dinner, family dinner on Thursday. And I'm going to tell them the story. It'll explain a lot about my life, why I've done all this international stuff, and why." So it'd be really fascinating for them to hear this. And it will be huge for them to understand who I am, just to hear this story. And then there was kind of a next step to that. I said, "Does she know the impact she had in your life? And what would that mean to her?" And she'd passed away. So she said, "No, she's gone. So I can't tell her, but she has a daughter." She got married later on, and actually it's a stepdaughter she adopted. And they were really close. She goes, she would love hearing this, and it would mean a lot to her to know that. And I said, okay, so that's what she was doing. That's what we call the person of influence activity or exercise. And we can send you this if you want it. It just kind of walks you through it, but you can see how easy this is. And this is easy. It's not easy. Sometimes it's easier if somebody is asking you the questions than if you're doing it yourself. But if you start thinking about people who had a big influence in your life, or trips or things like that had a big influence in your life, and you can just write down, okay, this is what happened. This is when it happened. This is what happened. This is what I learned from it. This is how it changed my life. And ideally, if there's something beyond that, this is how I hope you get what you get from this and how it can change your life. That would, it's just a huge thing that you can do. So let me walk you through that again. And I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to ask the question and I'm going to pause. And I want you, if you can, if you've got paper and pencil, something, just jot it down or just think through what this is. So that first part is, most people had somebody growing up in their lives. So think, before you're out of college, when you were a kid. And a lot of times what I hear from, it's parents of some of their friends, or it's a coach or a pastor or a teacher or something like that. But someone in your life, and a lot of times we want to make it outside your parents, who had a big impact and did something. So think of that person. And when you've thought of that person, write down his or her name, or their name, if it's a couple. And then as you think about that, either jot down or think about it. What was it? I mean, what did they do? What did you learn from them? And how'd you learn it? And by that, I mean, did they tell you something? Did they tell you a story and tell you something? Or did they just live it? Did they model it? How did they convey whatever it is that you learned from them? And that's going to take a little bit of time. So, we're not going to take a lot of time now to do that, but just jot down some bullet points that you can add. I'll give you a minute here. And then what I want you to do is think about what difference that made in your life. How are you different today because of that person's influence and what they did or said or how they acted? How's that impacted you, and what difference has it made in your life? And then the last part, well, not the last part, the last part of this is, what would it mean to your kids? If they don't know that story, what value would it be to them to know that story? And then the next step beyond that is, if that person's still around, do they know that they made that difference, and what would it mean to them to know that they made a difference in your life? You can do that. I've had people that have a kind of a methodology here. Once a month, they sit down and take the time and write a story. Think about somebody who made a difference in their lives. And they started, like I said, in grade school or junior high and stuff. But then as they progress, they're telling stories about coworkers or bosses or employees or people they worked with or people that they met, in their adult life that made a difference. You'll be surprised as you do that, if you get into that habit, how many stories you have. That's one of the things that I hear all the time. I don't have a story. Everybody's got a story, and bringing back, everybody's got a lot of stories. And those stories make up who you are. Telling those stories opens things up in terms of building a culture of communication and trust. When you're open with your kids and tell them some of these stories, especially these stories, because these are all positive and how it impacted you, it has an influence on them, and it gives them that foundation of knowing where they came from that leads to that resilience and all the stuff we talked about earlier. When you get to the next level, you can start telling stories where things didn't go right. Because a lot of times what I find when you're building the relationships and that culture in the family, your kids and grandkids are comparing themselves to you as you are today, to them as they are today. And so if you're 18 or 19 or 20 years old, I mean, my grandkids are 10 to 16 right now. When they look at me, it's like, that's such a big gap. I can never be, he's written books, he's done all this stuff. But in reality, they are ahead of where I was at that age. And so as you're telling these stories, if you can honestly say to your kids or grandkids, you're way ahead of where I was at your age. Now, all of a sudden you level the playing field and give them this invigoration. It's like giving them a shot of adrenaline of what they can do if they put their mind to it. So that's the model. And that's something that, like I said, we use a lot. And I got done a little bit faster than I thought I would. I thought I'd have about 10 minutes for questions. We're gonna have more than that. But and that's why we have it in the middle here of this, of the 3-part series, because this is going to be a real important part if you're going to get to the next part about using philanthropy as a training tool. It's training for what? And this is part of what does that. So the Sustaining Family Wealth and Unity Across Generations white paper is one thing that you can help. Though I just talked about the 3rd component to successful multi-generational planning. All that does is explain how what we're talking about here and preparing the next generations and things, how that fits and enhances the financial planning and estate planning you've probably already done. So it doesn't compete with it, doesn't do anything else. It enhances and builds on the things that they've done. And then the 3rd piece is the creating multi-generational transformational philanthropy. That will be in prep for, and that's what we'll talk about a lot in the September meeting. So with that, yeah, that's how you can get a hold of us. And if you want to send me an email directly to get some of this information stuff, you see that admin@genesegroup.com. Take out admin, put in Rod. So rod@genesegroup.com will come to me directly. And then if you've got a question of anything we've talked about, or if you want some more examples, or even the person of influence exercise, there's more to it than that we can send you. Because if you can take that kind of to the next level, the next level is for you to think about, to a young person to think about, okay, if you have the opportunity to be that person in somebody else's life, what would that mean to you? And what do you need to do to be that person? So Annie, I see you're back on.
Well, thank you, Rod, for all this valuable information. And you're right on about the power of our family stories on multi-generational planning, because if we don't tell them, who else is going to tell them? And
Right.
How are we going to know, for the future generations? So thank you so much. And now we are going to take some time to answer a few questions we got from the audience.
Okay.
And the first one, I think you touched a little bit about the life story, but there may be some other examples we're looking at. So what kinds of stories should we collect?
There's a couple ways of doing that. One is, think about if you could talk to your great grandparents, or somebody that in your background that you didn't really get a chance to talk to, that made some difference, and you had some questions for them. What would you ask them? And that can kind of give you an idea of the stories that your kids might want to know from you. I was talking to one family, and they were in Oregon, and so their great grandparents had come across on the Oregon Trail. And if you've ever seen a covered wagon, they're not big, and everything was over there. And they all knew Grandpa's story. And I said, what would you like to know? And they said, I would love to talk to Grandma and find out, what she was thinking about when he said, okay, we're going to put everything in this little wagon and go to where we don't know anything, what it's going to be like, or if that's assuming that we don't get killed by the Indians on the way. So one way to think about this is, what would have liked to have known from people before you? That's one thing. Another thing is, think about if I do this a lot in my own mind now. If you have a chance to go back, okay, so think 50 years from now, and you're gone or whatever, you get to go back and talk to your great-great-granddaughter or great-great-grandson who hasn't met you, and you only get like 10 minutes. What would you tell them? That's a good place to start. Whatever that is, that's a story to, how you learned that or whatever it is, that's a good place to start. So I hope maybe that helps a little bit. Just think of the things that you would have liked to have known, and think of the things that you would like to tell people who won't meet you.
That's a very good and valid answer, I think. So another question, where do you start when your kids are in their 20s?
Well, you can start when you're telling bedtime stories. That's, I've seen families that's when they start. If your kids are in their 20s, you can start talking about, that's when they're making the shifts. Now they have to start paying rent and finding a house and doing all that kind of stuff. And so you can start by talking about when you were their age and what you had to do to get ready to do. And then you can go to, and I got that training because of things that I did earlier. So you can tell this, you kind of build up to the story of what they're doing now. But if they're in their 20s or 30s, they'll want to know some of the things that you had to go through that are different, what they had to go through, but also the things that they're about to go through that you've gone through. So make it in the context of, you know, when I had to buy my first house, I had to do this, this, and this, or when I had to, you know, and we've all had, you know, pluses and minuses that happen when I got fired from my first job, you know, any of those things that made a difference in your life and things that you learned from. Business owners are great with this, although they hate it. But like business owners, one of the questions I'll ask is, was your business ever in trouble? Well, they've all been in trouble. I mean, you know, they all have a story, and it's probably not a story that they ever told anybody because they, you know, they were embarrassed or whatever. But the question is, could your kids or grandkids benefit from that if they knew that story? So some of these stories, it's don't do what I did. You know, it's if you learn from something and you can keep it so that they don't have to, you know, pound their head against that same wall, that's a good thing, and it makes you real.
That is so true. And I think you make a great point that not all the stories have to be, you know, happy and good, but also talk about the struggles.
Right.
Absolutely.
And what got you through those troubles.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So we have another question. My family is spread all over the continent, and just getting together can be difficult, much less having intimate story conversations. We may get together one Thanksgiving or another, maybe. Is there a way to keep that conversation going, keep people engaged, and still keep a record for future generations? Or in other words, getting started is a tough momentum to beat.
Yeah, it is. You know, it's what is it? The most difficult part of any journey is the first step, and so getting starting is. Actually, what I have found is, thank you to the pandemic, what we're doing right now has really made this a lot easier for a lot of families. But keep it short. You want to do two things. You want to do something that they want to do and that's important to them. And you might ask them, you know, what are the things that you want some help with or whatever. But I have families that I know have set aside, you know, the third Thursday, you know, between this time and that time, we're going to be on Zoom for half an hour or an hour at the longest, but like a half an hour. The issue you have there though is like, I'm on Eastern time, my mom is on Pacific time, and my cousin's in Hawaii. So, you know, we've got 6 time zones just with us. And so finding the time that you can do that, but if you can do it in short bites, and just make it, like I said, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, maybe. And again, it has to be something that, especially when you start, it's got to be fun, and it's got to be something they learn from and it's useful to them. So it's not just, let me tell you when I was 12. It's, you know, things that are going to impact what they're doing right now or about to be dealing with. But Zoom has really opened things up. We've also done this with like book clubs, you know, like not with novels and things, but like crucial conversations or things like that anybody can use no matter what they're doing in life. And then that gives you an opportunity to be talking through it with the whole family. And then when stories come up, they come up.
Very good point. Okay, another question. Have you found that it is the big stories, such as who made a difference in their lives, that are most important? I'm wondering if it may often be an accumulation of the little stories, but communicating this often takes a lot of contact. Can this be done with limited contact?
Yeah, it can be done with limited contact. And you're right. I mean, sometimes it's, you know, sometimes there's one big story that was a big turning point. Sometimes it's a lot of little stories that led you to this turning point. And so it can be done. And again, this is where the electronics help a lot. One way you can do it is if you've got Zoom, you've probably got the record function. Tell the story. Just go on Zoom, press the button, tell the story, and then you can email that out to everybody in the family. So you don't have to get them all together at the same time. And you can just, you know, do this. And again, if they're fun, they're entertaining, and there are things that they can learn from, and or there are things that they can learn from, and they're short, they'll watch them. I mean, don't make them an hour long, but if you have, you know, well, that person of influence that we did with the lady at the conference, that took like 10 minutes. And so you turn on Zoom, press record, tell the story for 10 minutes, download the recording and send it off. And One of the things you have to remember when you're working with a family, our mantra is invite them all, but work with the willing. Not all of them may be interested, and that's okay, but some of them may be. And even if it's only one, that helps, going down the road. So send it out to all of them. Those who want to watch it will watch it. But that way you don't have to coordinate schedules or anything. Mm-hmm. It's a really short thing that they're going to do, and they're on their phones anyway, right? So they're on their phone, they can click the thing, and it's a video. That's easy.
Yeah, and a little follow-up to that also. Are there any online resources you can recommend to help tell and share our stories?
Actually, Randy's got one that he talked about, and I talked to Randy. I talked to Lori, and she's used it, so I know it works. There's one called, is it Storyworth? Maybe Randy can come on and talk about this. But yeah, I know that's one, and it kind of walks you through like I just did. It kind of asks you questions. Tell us about this. And then you do it, and then it'll put the book together. And there's other things like that are out there where you can do it electronically. But then remember, there's two kinds of stories. One kind of story is just the story, and they're fun and entertaining and things like that. And those are real important because they get a feel for who the family is and kind of the things that you do and stuff. The other is what we call heritage stories, and we do an heritage statement. And those are the life lessons, the turning points in your life. What made you go the way you went, and what did you learn that is important? So one is turning points, and one is history more. Both are important, but don't just do the history part. You want to also make sure that you're telling the stories that made you who you are.
That's great that you're differentiating between those two kinds of stories. And then what do you suggest as the best place to keep the stories? Should it be together with the family estate plan, trust, will, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've done, one of the things that I've seen people do is they'll put them down on a thumb drive or whatever so that they've got it with the other documentation, which I'm sure is going to change over time because we found that, CDs break or whatever over time and all that stuff. So you may have to do like we're doing now and taking CDs in and getting them onto SIM cards. But yeah, that's one way of doing it. A lot of families have set up their own website. And I'm not going to do that. My 14-year-old will. Okay, this is something, if you give that, you throw it out there and say, would somebody want to put together a website for us? It would be, you'll be surprised. Somewhere between 12 and 14, 15 years old, 18 years old that'll a project that they'd be willing to jump into. And it gives them a role in the family, and they feel like, they're impacting positively and they're doing something that's fun for them. So that's one thing I've seen is turn it over to one of the teenage kids and say, can you create a website that we can download things to? That's not that hard to do. I mean, if you have the URL, I think rod@rodzeeb.com is like, I think it cost me $10 a year or something from Whois.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, building a family culture may seem daunting. What is one easy step to take to start the communication process so that, the one family member doesn't feel awkward calling? Should just call a family dinner or event and then bring it up?
Yeah, I mean, even if you don't call a family dinner or event, you just do little things when you're together anyway. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is we have an activity we call I appreciate you because. So like anytime you get everybody together, whether it's Thanksgiving or a birthday or, my mom's 90th birthday is coming up, we're all going to be together. One of the things we'll do is go around the room and everybody will, I appreciate my cousin, whoever, because of this. And you don't have to go, if it's a big group, you're not going to go all the way around the room for everybody or it's going to take forever. So, pick one person or two people and do that. But when somebody says, I appreciate you because of this, there's usually a story that goes behind it. And so just that activity of taking a minute or two, I appreciate them because of this, then you can follow up with, where did that come from? Can you tell that story? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I appreciate you because is easy. it's positive. Everybody's telling a positive story, not, so that's a good place to start. And you can do that anytime you get people together.
Wow. Well, what a way to come to the end of this fantastic presentation, Rod, with the appreciate you, because I think it's a great takeaway. And thank you so much. And thanks to all our audience for joining us today. Our featured speakers in this Plan Giving seminar series are experts in a variety of fields, including estate planning, trust law, wealth advising, real estate, tax, and charitable giving. They have graciously agreed to share their time and knowledge with the SJSU community, and we are very grateful, just as right today. And our third webinar of this 3-session webinar series will be taking place in September, and we look forward to seeing you then. If you have any additional questions or wish to get in touch with Rod, please contact Randy Baylaw, SJSU's Director of Plan Giving, or visit us on the web at legacy.sjsu.edu. Thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you.